Says murdered, Isabella, Asher. Says murdered, Mia. Says murdered, Hercules, Centauri. Says murdered, Pegasus, Lucky. Says murdered, Sebastian. Says murdered, Procyon. Says murdered, Lyra. Says murdered, Villager. Says murdered, Spica. Tara 10 joined the game. Says murdered, Ethan. Tara 10 says back. Says murdered, Jack. Says murdered, Avery, and Terry's. Says murdered, Tara 10. Says murdered, Guest. Says murdered, Henry. Says murdered, Draco. Says murdered, Charlotte. Says murdered, Benjamin, Cassiopeia. Says murdered, Ellie. Says murdered, Arya. Tara 10 says wanna do something else? Subberlower says NRN. Says murdered, Oliver. Says murdered, Leo. Tara 10 says okay. Tara 10 says I gotta play Roblox. Tara 10 says bye. Subberlower says Saya. Tara 10 left the game. Comma game mode ending soon. Says murdered, William. Says murdered, Lacerda, Taurus. Says murdered, Pixis. Says murdered, Mila, Beckrix. Says murdered, Andromeda, Gianna, Luna, Noah. Subro Orbis says Subro. Subro Orbis says, Subro. Power out, requested by, Subro Orbis. Says murdered, Orion, Shala. Power restored, requested by, Subro Orbis. Says murdered, Arcturus, Sophia. Says murdered. Says murdered, Lynx. Comma game mode ending in 10 seconds. Says murdered, Pollux. Says survivors, Subro Orbis. Says survivors, Lily, Gemini, Ava, Beetlejuice, Rigel, Regulus, Olivia, Boötes, Vega, Jackson, Deneb, Camilla, Emma, Adara, Aldebaran, Evelyn, Sophia, Aurora, Virgo, Mateo. Comma new game mode, classic mode, starting in 10 seconds. Comma classic mode, run and hide from the murderer with infinite lives and free play. Keep surviving to earn XP and avoid being caught.